Revelation is a book that was written to be all read at once. When Jesus visited John on the island of Patmos and gave him the revelation and told him to circulate it among the 7 churches of Asia Minor, they would go to the church, they would read the entire thing. They didn't study a little bit at a time. Now we have to do it this way now because we're not familiar with apocalyptic literature, and services would be pretty long if we studied it all or read it all together. But I want to encourage you, if you've never done this, to sit and read Revelation, the whole thing through, all 22 chapters. It takes a little while, not a long time. It'd probably surprise you how quickly you could read that. I don't know how fast you read, so I'm not going to guess how long that'll take, but that will help you to see the pace of what's going on. Because as we're studying it, and particularly the seals and how they're open and how patient God is, He's opening the seals, which are warnings of what's to come, and this is how it's going to be revealed. This is what's going to happen. And He's patiently watching and seeing. And He's only sending a little bit of the judgment out, not drastic, a little bit, so they see it's coming. This is a taste of what's going to happen. But He's looking for repentance. And then the same thing with the trumpets. He blows the trumpets. And as each one is blown, there's a little bit of judgment that comes with it. But it's just so that people will have time to repent. And then John hears the 7 thunders. And he gets ready to write down what the 7 thunders say. And what's John told? Don't write it down. Why? There will be delay no longer. Enough warnings. And then we get to the bowls. And boom, 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 boom. Quickly, all 7 bowls are poured out with the full wrath of God. And there's no more fractions. There's no third of this or half of that. It's all full outpouring of the wrath of God. And so that's what we studied last week as we studied through chapter 16, and I think we did 15 and 16 last week. Last week we looked at Armageddon. Armageddon means Mount Megiddo. Megiddo is the place where many battles were fought, and God always had decisive victory at Armageddon. And so that's what the place came to mean to the Israelites. And it's similar to the way we use the word Waterloo. That was like their Waterloo that was coming up. And if you back up to chapter 16 and look with me, it says that these messages that were coming from the mouth of the dragon, I'm in verse 13, mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, these were being preached to the kings of the whole earth in verse 14. To gather them for war of the great day of God the Almighty. There's going to be a war, and Satan is rallying the troops, and they're going to war against the Lamb, we're going to find out. They're going to fight against Jesus. And I won't tell you who wins because we get to read it in chapter 19, and I'll just say it's going to be good, all right? It's going to be real good. So that's something to come, something to look forward to. So now we have the outpouring of all the wrath of God. So now all that's left in Revelation, these next few chapters, is just telling us how this is all going to go down. This is what it's going to look like, apocalyptically. And so we're going to see what's going to happen to the Roman Empire now that the bowls have been poured out. The full wrath of God is poured out on the Roman Empire. So I need 3 readers. So who would read for me first? Okay, right up here, Chase, or TJ, to Chase. And then John, did you wave your finger? Okay, John will be next, and then a third buddy. All right, very good. So let's read in chapter 17, beginning in verse 1, and let's stop at Let's stop at verse 6.
Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. And he carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. And on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. When I saw her, I wondered greatly.
So, one of the 7 angels, the ones who just poured out these bowls, comes and says, I'm going to show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed these acts of immorality. The word for immorality is pornuo. It means specifically sexual immorality. Pornuo, or at the end of the verse, is porneia, where it says immorality. That is sexual immorality. They were committing acts of sexual immorality as part of their pagan worship. And this woman, who we will identify very soon, was leading them into this immorality. They're made drunk with the wine of this immorality. John is carried away in the Spirit. In verse 3, we've encountered this phrase before. It means to be in close proximity with God, close proximity with the Spirit. Into the wilderness. The woman is there. She's sitting on a scarlet beast. This beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. Where have we encountered 7 heads and 10 horns before? Say it louder. In chapter 13, which beast? The sea beast or the earth beast? The sea beast, the first one. Okay. All right. So that one had 7 heads. I wonder if this is the same beast. So the woman is clothed in purple. She has scarlet. She's adorned in gold. She's doing pretty good, isn't she? This is pretty easy for her, isn't there? This woman is in contrast to the one we read about in chapter 12. Remember the woman in chapter 12 who was pregnant, who was being chased by a giant dragon? She was not having a good time. Here is a woman, and she's got it easy. Now, we remember the woman in chapter 12. Who was she? Church. Okay, church is the C plus answer. Good, good. What's the A? Old and New Covenant kingdom. The kingdom of the Old and New Covenant. And so that's the church, the kingdom, not having a good time. This woman, who, let's go ahead and identify her. Look at the last verse in chapter 17. It says, the woman who you saw is the great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth. We've already identified who the great city is. Who is that? That's Rome. Who's the holy city? Jerusalem. But when you see the great city, that's Rome. We also see in verse 5 that she's got a name right there on her forehead, Babylon the Great. Remember Babylon the Great? Look back at chapter 16 and verse 19. The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nation fell. Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. And so the great city is Babylon the Great. The great city is Rome, therefore Babylon the Great is Rome. And so that's who this is, this woman. So the woman in chapter 12 who represents the church, the kingdom, is not doing good. And this woman's got it easy. She's drinking out of a gold cup. Life is good for her. And so at the end of verse 6, John says, I wondered greatly about this. I'm wondering about it too, aren't you? There's supposed to be some justice going on here. Well, wait a minute. Just give it a little time, because things are not as they seem, and all the wrongs will be made right before this is all over. This woman is, verse 6, drunk on the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. So just picture that. She's had her fill, more than her fill, of the blood of the saints. And of course, many of the saints died actually in the physical city of Rome, but especially in the Roman Empire, and died because of the laws of the Roman Empire. All right, let's read on here. So TJ, right over here to John. And John, if you wouldn't mind reading verses 7 through verse 11, please.
And I saw the angel, and the angel said unto me, Wherefore dost thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman, and of the beast that carrieth her, which hath the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that thou sawest was not, and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they beheld the beast that was, and is not, and yet is. And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains, on which the woman sitteth. And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition.
Okay, thank you. So, the angel must have seen the look on John's face, because he's wondering about this. And so this angel says, why do you wonder about this? I'm going to tell you the mystery about this woman and the beast she rode in on. Right? Let's talk about them. First of all, this beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. As we've already mentioned, that was the same as the beast, the sea beast in chapter 13. And the beast in chapter 13, we discovered, represented the civil persecuting ability of the Roman Empire, which centered around the emperors themselves. There were 7 that were significant. The first 7 emperors were very significant, but there were 10 crowns. And the reason for that is because there were 5 who were emperors, and they were Augustus, and then Tiberius, Caligulus, Claudius, and Nero. That's the 5. Nero, in 58 AD, killed himself, took his own life. That caused civil war in Rome. They were fighting to see who would be the next. There were 3 little usurper kings who rose up and didn't even last long enough to be considered emperors. All of that, they rose and fell in the year 69 AD. Well, the first one, and his name was Galbo, he started at the end of 68 AD and the beginning of 69, he fell. And then the next one was Ortho, and he fell, and then Vitellius. They didn't last very long. Vespasian is down in Palestine, in Jerusalem, and he watches them fight it out and weaken each other and kill all their own soldiers. And when they're all done fighting, he comes up and takes on the winner and takes the throne. And he is the 6th king. So, in verse 8, when it says, the beast that you saw, who was and is not, that would have been Nero. Now, Nero is not the whole beast. We talked about that last week, remember? He just is kind of representing part of the beast here. But he was, and at the time this is written, he is not. So that tells us that the book was written after 68 AD, after he killed himself. And is about to come, I'm in verse 8, he's about to come up out of the abyss and go to his destruction. Now this is Domitian. Domitian started his reign in 81 AD. Who was Domitian's father? Vespasian. Vespasian was his father. Who was his brother? Titus, all right. So, here is Domitian mentioned. He's about to come up. And so, the book was written sometime after Nero died and before Domitian came to power, before he reigned. If we're understanding the text correctly, and if our secular history is correct in its dates, that would put it between 68 and 81 A.D. The rest of verse 8, it talks about those who dwell on the earth, whose names are not written in the book of life. They wonder when they see the beast, who was and is not and will come. Now, not only did Christians suffer under Nero's reign, the Romans themselves suffered a great deal too. Nero just wasn't paranoid against the Christians, he was paranoid against his own people. And he ordered many Romans to the death. Just if he had the slightest suspicion that they might betray him, he'd just go, and they were dead. And so they were glad to be rid of Nero, just like the Christians were. But now they're wondering, because he's coming back? Nero is coming back? Yes, he is. He's going to come back in the person of Domitian. Verse 9, here's the mind that takes wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Rome is known as the city on 7 hills. It's famous for that. And so he's talking about Rome. But it's also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. Already listed the 5. Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. 5 have fallen. 1 is, that would be Vespasian. 1's yet to come, that's Titus, Vespasian's son. And then he mentions an 8th king in verse 11 who goes to his destruction. Look back up at verse 8. He's about to come out of the abyss and goes to the destruction. That's the same one. That is Domitian. Everybody follow that? You're saying, oh, I'm glad I got that all written down in the notes. Why is that important? It's important because this is how I date the book. And I've been criticized in my book for the way I date Revelation. Many put a much later date on it. The reason I date it between 69 and 79 AD is that's when Vespasian was reigning. And this text says 5 have fallen, 1 is, and 1 is yet to come. So unless I'm off on my secular countings, and that's secular, it's not God-inspired, but if Augustus was the first emperor, and that's what Roman history records, you count from there as 5. The 3 usurper kings, they didn't count. The next one has to be Vespasian. 1 is. Vespasian reigned from 69 to 79 AD, and so I believe that the book of Revelation was written in that time.
I think I could be wrong, but I think one of the reasons for the backlash against that is because there's another theory that the book of Revelation is not talking about Rome, but it's talking about the Jews.
The destruction of Jerusalem, yeah 70 AD.
And so they want to put it after so that it cannot be referring to the Jews.
Oh, I see. Yeah, to attack the preterist position. Yeah. Now, of course, the preterist.
I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's necessary because it seems very clear. But I wonder if that's why they do that.
Yeah, the preterists are pushing for the earlier date.
Yeah.
They've got to have it before 70 AD. Exactly. But the ones who are trying to refute the preterist view are saying, no, it was 90, 90 AD, which would make John pretty old if that was the case when he was on the island of Patmos. But there's another reason for the later date, and that is that secular writings, not the Bible, records that Domitian was the one who exiled John to Patmos. And so they say, see, it was during Domitian's reign. But I've read those texts. It doesn't say it was during his reign. It just says Domitian was the one who exiled him. Could Domitian not do that during his father's reign? If his dad is the king, what is he? He's a prince. Wouldn't he have authority to throw a guy in jail? Oh, you bet he would. So that's why And, it's not that I think I'm smarter than all these other guys, but I've not seen enough evidence to change my view on that. I still hold to the view that the book of Revelation was written between 69 and 79 AD.
It's also said that while Vespasian and Titus were in Jerusalem, that the emperor de facto was Domitian himself. He was actually running Rome because the other two were over in Jerusalem.
Okay, yeah.
And that timed it perfectly with when John would have been exiled to Ephesus.
Yes, it would. If you didn't hear what Buddy said, and I'm supposed to repeat it for the recording anyway, when Vespasian was in Jerusalem and he was appointed to be over Jerusalem, his son Domitian was actually up in Rome and was how did you put it, a de facto? Emperor de facto, and would have authority to exile John to the island of Patmos. So, good point. Anybody else? Some of you are like, man, this is good stuff, this is good stuff. Some of you are like, what in the world is he talking about? Some of that's not super important. I agree, but if this is going out on the web, I have to be aware some people are going to say, why are you dating this? I want to be very, very clear why I hold the position I do, because I'll get some emails over this probably, and I want to be able to say, I explain that on the video. This is why I hold the position that I do. All right. The beast in verse 11, which was and is not, which would be Nero, is himself an eighth king. He's one of the seven, and he goes to destruction. And so that would be Domitian, who his nickname, by the way, was the bloody arm of Nero. Domitian was known as the bloody arm of Nero. Not that they were the only two emperors that persecuted the Christians. There were plenty others that did. But in his paranoia and in his policies, he was a twin of Nero. So Domitian and Nero were just so much alike. Yes, Cody.
And it talks about that he goes to his destruction. Does Rome fall during his reign?
Started to. Yeah, it's a long way to the canvas, okay? But yeah, it was a general fall. But the death blow was actually before Domitian even came to power. But when it says he goes to his destruction, I don't think it means the Roman Empire. I think it means him. Right. Okay, good questions. Let's pick up then with verse 12, and Buddy's got the next one. If you would, Buddy, through verse 18.
And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour, together with the beast. These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw, where the prostitute is seated, are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked, and devour her flesh, and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is a great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth.
Right. Just hearing Buddy read that is reminded, his translation says that the woman was a prostitute. Mine says she was a harlot. The reason she was called that is because rather than being faithful to one true God, she had many gods. So it's spiritual harlotry, spiritual prostitution that she is guilty of. 10 horns are 10 kings, but they haven't received a kingdom. Isn't that an odd statement? Here we've been talking about these emperors, and it's their kingdom. And if you went to Rome and you walked in, and if Vespasian was reigning, he would be on the throne. What does it mean he doesn't have a kingdom? If he doesn't have the kingdom, who has it? Who has it? Where is the beast getting his information from? From Satan. And so whose kingdom is this really? This is Satan's. They don't have a kingdom. They're puppets. The real enemy is Satan, who's behind all this. And I say that because, Ephesians 6, it says our battle's not against flesh and blood. We keep attacking people and say, oh man, that horrible government of ours and all these names we list. Hey, if there's evil behind that, it's not the people. Satan is your enemy. That's who we need to be addressing our energy towards. He is the enemy. Our battle's not with flesh and blood. And the Christians back in the first century, that's what Jesus is telling them. It's not their kingdom, it's Satan's. That's who we need to be battling. That's who your real enemy is. Verse 13, they have one purpose. They give their power and authority to the beast. So that's what they are all about. They're giving all their power and authority to the beast, and the beast is hearing the voice of the dragon, going back to the previous chapter, and that is Satan. Going back 3 chapters to chapter 13, 4 chapters. What are they going to do next? Oh, verse 14. They want to wage war against the Lamb. They want to fight against Jesus. So this is Armageddon, if you will. And it is the assembly of the kings of the earth under the domination of the Roman Empire, and they are going to take on Jesus. They're going to fight against Jesus. And we get to read that battle in chapter 19. I can't wait to get there. It's so neat. Okay? You're going to get to see that battle. And I'm not going to give any of it away. No spoilers here. But you can read it if you want. And you might be able to guess who wins, right? You probably can figure that one out. But it's a great battle. But they're so foolish. They think they can defeat the Lamb. And it says here, the Lamb will overcome them because he's the Lord of lords and he's the King of kings, and those who are with him are the called and the chosen and the faithful. And then he says, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. The Roman Empire, their authority depended on the cooperation of the people. I was reading this, and this is later on in Roman history, but Rome actually reached a point where they had conquered so many other nations, and they had so many slaves. The slaves in Rome outnumbered the citizens of Rome. And if the slaves ever figured that out, they could have overrun the citizens and taken over the town, taken over the city. One of the emperors got smart and actually gave the slaves citizenship. Now he did that so he could tax them, but that was his solution to the problem. But they had a lot of slaves in the city. They were dependent upon the people. Verse 10, the 10 horns that you saw and the beast, these will hate the harlot. Now who is the harlot? The city of Rome. Who's the 10 horns? The kings, the emperors. The emperor's going to hate their own city? They sure are. They sure did. They hated their own city. That's what the message is. I mean, you have to look close there. That one almost slipped by you, didn't it? He's saying these 10 emperors hate their own city. What did Nero do to his own city? He set it on fire in 64 AD while he sang the song, The Sack of Troy. I know a lot of people say he fiddled. Actually, he sang the song, the sack of Troy. I don't know the song, don't ask me. But that's what he did while his own city was burning. And why did he set it on fire? He blamed the Christians for it, but he had a purpose to build his palace, his golden palace, which to this day is the largest palace that was ever built. I can't remember how many miles that it covered, but he wanted that all cleared out so he could build his own little, it's called the Golden Palace. But he didn't care about the people, he didn't care about the city, he cared about himself. They hated the harlot, they hated their own city. They're going to make her desolate and naked, they're going to eat her flesh, and they're going to burn her up with fire. Isn't that interesting? God has put in their hearts, in verse 17, to execute his purpose by having a common purpose and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. Now, wait a minute. God's going to accomplish his purpose through these pagan Roman emperors? Is that what that's saying? Yes, he is. Yes, he is. God's been doing that a long time. God works through ungodly people to accomplish his purpose. He doesn't have much choice. We're all kind of ungodly, aren't we? And so he is working through them to accomplish his purpose. And they don't even realize they're being used by God, but they will be used for his purpose. We've already explained verse 18. So let's go on to chapter 18. And give me a new reader, please. Who's got that? Pat, you got it? Right up here, TJ. Yes?
You may have talked about this, but the term King of Kings was quite commonly used, even I think as far back as some of the Mesopotamian kingdoms. A lot of kings refer to themselves in that way because of kind of the way their government was, their kingdom was set up. They refer to themselves as King of Kings. So for Jesus to take this term and then use it on itself, this kind of shows his superiority in that way.
I did not cover that. I'm glad you brought that up. For the sake of the video, Logan just pointed out that Jesus was not the first one to use the phrase King of Kings, that many of the Mesopotamian kings would refer to themselves that way. But he was also Lord of Lords. So, very good. All right, Pat, if we could read chapter 18, verses 1 through verse 8, please.
After these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illumined with his glory. And he cried out with a mighty voice, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place of demons, and a prison of every unclean spirit, and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive of her plagues. For her sins have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back even as she has paid, and give back to her double according to her deeds. In the cup which she has mix twice as much for her. To the degree that she glorified herself and lived sensuously, to the same degree give her torment and mourning. For she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, and I am not a widow, and will never see mourning. For this reason, in one day her plagues will come, pestilence and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire. For the Lord God who judges her is strong.
You know, we don't talk enough about these angels, but I'm pretty impressed with these angels. That one in chapter 10 was pretty impressive. The one that was standing on the land and the sea, and gigantic, big, powerful angel. This one comes to the earth, and look what he does in verse 1. The earth was illumined with his glory. Just picture that. He comes down and you can actually see his glory illuminating the earth. These angels are powerful, and they are all at God's beck and call. And this angel cries out with a mighty voice, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. Has Babylon the Great, which is Rome, has it fallen already? No, we've talked about that. But if God says they're goners, it's as good as done. There's nothing can be done about it. Rome is going down. It's just a matter of time. Some heads are going to roll. And Rome has opposed the people of God and is going to pay for their ungodliness. That she has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. There's some bad birds there in Rome. I don't know if they're angry birds or not. There's bad birds there in Rome. All the nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her immorality. The kings of the earth committed acts of immorality with her. And these merchants who have benefited from her. Now, back in chapter 17, when it says in verse 1, I'll show you the judgment of the harlot who sits on many waters. The waters in verse 15 are identified as multitudes of people, a sea of people, but Rome also had control of the waters, the physical waters, and that's where all their sea trade was, and that's how Rome kept their cash flow, is through the trade with these other countries and the tribute that these other countries had to pay to Rome because they had been conquered by Rome. So they are all through these sea paths, the merchants of the earth, they become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. This other voice from heaven says, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive of her plagues." The 7 churches of Asia Minor, what was Jesus telling them to do right here? What does he mean, come out of her? Okay. Did he mean they need to move, Don? Do they need to move away? No. Don't need to move. He says very specifically, don't participate in their sins. Don't bow a knee to their pagan gods. Don't be involved in their immoralities. Don't eat the food sacrificed to idols. Don't cave in on your faith just so you can belong to the trade guild. In other words, they didn't have to move away. He's just saying separate yourself spiritually and in your action and your behavior from the way those around you are behaving. You see a practical message there for us today? We don't have to move away, but right where we're at, we need to make sure there's a distance in the way that we behave and the way unbelievers behave. There should be a distance. People should be able to tell by looking at you and by watching the way you behave that you are a believer in Christ. It should be night and day. It should be crystal clear. Well, is it? Think about that. There should be a difference between how you're behaving and how you react to others and the things that you say and will not say. That should be very different from the world. Come out of her, my people, was the message for them. Verse 5, for her sins have piled up as high as the heavens, and God has remembered her iniquities. Yes?
I also want to mention the implication of that command. Very practical, but also in its implication to his audience. What does it mean if he says something like this, and the implication is don't eat meat offered to idols and don't, we're talking about hunger, maybe even starvation to death. We're talking about persecution, maybe to death. We're talking about a lot of pain and suffering here that is going to come by consequence of not allying themselves with Rome. It could very well be to the death in many instances. This statement is very powerful in that sense because it's almost like saying, "Are you willing to give your life for me?"
Yeah, very good point, Logan. Logan was stating that by separating themselves and not eating the meat sacrificed to idols. We got to remember, these Christians were literally starving to death. Literally, because they couldn't belong to the trade guild. They had no way of making a means to support their families. And so when he says, "Come out of her, my people," for some of these Christians, that would have been the death sentence. Peace.
Be surprised how many times I've told my kids, take this book, give me book, chapter, and verse where it says it's easy.
Oh, yeah. It's not easy, is it? John says, give me book, chapter, and verse that says that it's easy to be a Christian. It's not. It's harder. I think it's the broad road that leads away from God and the narrow road that leads towards Him, if I remember right. So, yeah, it's not easy. And I just finished writing the Curtis's Corner for this upcoming Sunday, and I talked about how it's not easy to be a Christian and why we need to encourage one another. Because that's the way we defeat the discouragement of this world. And they had to be so discouraged back then. Our first century brethren had to have been so tough for them. And he's encouraging them to hang in there, but he's also telling them, don't give in. Wouldn't it be a shame to be living back then and you've been resisting, and then right before Jesus comes in judgment, you gave in? Wouldn't that be awful? You jumped on the wrong side, and here comes the wrath of God. Oh, man. Be like us when we just are so, I don't know if I can hang in there any longer, and we just give up like a week before the Lord's going to come. Hang tight. That's what he's telling them. Good point. Thank you, John and Logan, both, for your comments. Appreciate that. How far did I get? Did I get to verse 9, or verse 6, I mean? Pay her back, even as she is paid, and give her back double according to her deeds, in the cup that she has mixed, twice as much of her for her. Remember in the chapter before, she was drunk on the blood of the saints. And now the message is, she deserves this. It seems really harsh, but she deserves this. And look at her attitude in verse 7. To the degree that she glorified herself and lived sensually, to the same degree, give her torment and mourning. For she says, I sit as queen. I'm not a widow. I will never mourn. So arrogant, so haughty was the Roman Empire that even in the face of total judgment from God, still will not yield, still will not humble herself and yield to the will of God. In one day her plagues will come. Literally? No, it's not literal. Okay, but it's going to be like, wow, here one day and gone the next, in a sense, because there's going to be a time not long after this, people are going to look at, what happened to the Roman Empire? I thought that thing was going to go on forever. In lieu of all of history, it's going to seem like one day. It'll take a while for all this to be fulfilled, but it's going to be fulfilled. All right. End of verse 8 talks about, for the Lord our God who judges her is strong. Sounds like Hebrews 10:31. It is a dreadful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. You don't want to be opposed to God.